is really a trinity. Eventually, I came to question, did God really exist? And the reason I ended up becoming a doubter rather than a believer is because I simply couldn't solve this problem of suffering. I think that, in fact, if there is a God who's all-powerful and in charge of this world, we can't explain why there's so much suffering in it. And that was the moment at which I decided really I was probably an agnostic and not a believer.
And that change for you was one that I would imagine was pretty difficult.
It was difficult. I mean, if you're raised in the Christian tradition, this forms the very heart and soul of who you are. And leaving it means leaving friends. It means alienating family. It means losing out on all sorts of social networks that you have and all sorts of beliefs that you've held dear. And so it's very difficult and traumatic emotionally. But my view at the time was that I was in a search for what is true, and I came to believe it simply isn't true that the Bible is without error, and the idea that Jesus is God is an idea that was developed historically over time among Christians. It wasn't something that was original to Christianity. It's a later historical development. So too the doctrine of the Trinity, and these various ideas that I had held on to, I started to realize were historical formulations, and just the existence of God Himself. I finally came to realize that for me, it simply didn't make sense anymore.
So who is Athanasius?
Who is Athanasius? Yes, right. Okay, so I'm back in my PhD exams. Right, Athanasius. Athanasius was a very important figure in the history of early Christianity. He lived in the 4th century, and he was one of the leading figures at what was called the Council of Nicaea, which was the first big Christian council called together for Christians to deal with the problem of theology. And the issue had to do with who Christ is. Is he fully divine, or is he sort of a secondary divine being? And Athanasius argued that Jesus is God Himself. Not that He's God the Father, but that He is of equal standing with God the Father, and in fact is made of the same substance as God the Father, and that in fact He was never made, He'd always existed. And Athanasius is possibly even more famous for being the first author that we have from Christianity to list the books of the New Testament that we have, the 27 books, and to say these are the right 27 books, and the other books are not to be read. And so this eliminated all the other Gospels and epistles and apocalypses that were floating around in Christianity. So Athanasius did this. He wrote this letter in the year 367. So that's significant because it's about 300 years after most of these books had been written before anybody decided that this would be the New Testament and that there aren't other books.
Well, if you're just tuning in, the guest is Bart Ehrman, and the book is God's Problem. Again, it's just an absolutely fascinating book on why we suffer, and specifically looking at how the Bible answers those questions of suffering, both historically in the Old Testament and then more closer to our present time, I guess, in the New Testament as well. Is there a major distinction between those two? And for our television audience, what is the Bible's answer in the Old Testament in contrast to the New Testament?
Yeah, well, what I talk about in the book are the major ways different biblical authors deal with the problem of suffering. And so it turns out there are a lot of ways they talk about it. Some authors think that some authors of the Bible think that the reason people suffer is because they've sinned and God is punishing them. Other authors think that it's not God who's punishing them, that there are forces of evil in the world that are opposed to God that are punishing people. Some authors think that suffering is redemptive, that suffering is the way that salvation comes about. For example,
which is how Paul felt, correct?
Paul felt the suffering of Jesus is what brings about salvation for the world, and so suffering is redemptive. Some authors think that suffering is a big mystery, and we can't even question why we suffer. If you question why you suffer, you're virtually being blasphemous by questioning God. Some authors think that chaos happens and we get in the way sometimes. So there are a range of answers. The answer that's most dominant in the Old Testament is this answer that God is punishing people for their sins. It's found throughout the Old Testament from beginning to end. That answer is also found in the New Testament. And the prominent answer in the New Testament is also found in the Old Testament. The New Testament answer is that there's these cosmic forces of evil in the world, the devil and demons and other cosmic powers, and they're the ones who are causing the problems, and that God's soon going to intervene and overthrow these forces of evil and set up a good kingdom where there'll be no more suffering. That's the vision of most of the authors of the New Testament.
Is it just that there are so many inconsistent views on suffering that initially kind of put up your cautionary flags about the Christian faith? Isn't the Bible supposed to be, it's kind of human created, right?
Yeah, well, that's what I came to realize, is that it's a very human book. And I think that some of these answers to suffering are more acceptable to modern people than others. Mm-hmm. I was doing a radio show a couple months ago in Nebraska, and was talking on the radio show with a pastor who told me that he had a parishioner, a middle-aged woman, whose 12-year-old daughter had recently died of a brain tumor. And this woman told the pastor that she knew why her daughter had died. It was because she had promised God that she, the mother, would quit smoking, and she hadn't done it. And so God was punishing her by killing her daughter. And, the pastor and I both just thought, wow, is there really a God in the world that's punishing people for bad behavior? I mean, is that really why 300 people die of malaria every hour? Because God's punishing them? It just seems unlikely. And so even though this is a prominent view in the Bible, one has to evaluate these views and see, are they views that are really acceptable in the modern age?
Well, it's fascinating to think about. One of the things that you've talked about in your research, and that I found in doing some research for this interview, is just how many people translated the Bible from 100 AD to 300 AD. How many manuscripts are we talking about in existence at that point? Yeah,
well, this is an interesting thing that we think when we read the Bible that we're obviously reading the words that Matthew wrote or that Paul wrote. But the reality is we don't have the originals of Matthew or of Paul's letters or of any other book of the New Testament or of the Old Testament. What we have are copies of these books that were made later, in many cases, most cases, many centuries later. So the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and at present we have something like 5,500 manuscripts in Greek of the New Testament, which is a lot for an ancient book. It's far more than any other ancient book. The problem is most of these copies are hundreds and hundreds of years after the originals, and all of them have differences in them, so that the scribes who were copying these manuscripts changed the text that they were copying, sometimes by accident. I mean, sometimes they just made mistakes. They were sleepy or incompetent or whatever. But sometimes it looks like scribes actually thought the text should say something other than it did, and then they would change the text.
Does it strike you as a kind of manipulation of the text? Is that what's troubling about it to you?
Some places it looks like it's a manipulation of the text, where the author wants to change, where the scribe wants to change what the author said. I mean, in many cases it may be that the scribe thought this is what the author really meant, and so he changed it. But sometimes the text gets changed to say just the opposite of what it originally said, and so that can be a little bit troubling. Yeah.
What's the story with the last 12 verses of Mark in relation to this?
Yeah, so the last 12 verses of Mark they're very interesting. Jesus has been dead, he's been crucified, he's dead and been buried. And on the third day, the women go to the tomb to see about anointing his body for burial, but they find the tomb's empty. Jesus isn't there. There's a young man in the tomb who says that Jesus will go, that they're supposed to go tell the disciples that Jesus will go before them and meet them in Galilee. The disciples are supposed to go to Galilee, and the women are supposed to tell them to go. And then it says the women fled from the tomb and didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. That's the end of Mark's gospel. It ends with the women not saying anything. Well, some scribes read this ending and thought, well, that's odd. I mean, the women didn't tell anybody. I mean, surely the disciples knew. And so some scribes added a longer ending. So the last 12 verses are this longer ending. where the women do go tell the disciples. They do go to Galilee. Jesus does meet them there. And this is the passage where Jesus tells his disciples that if anyone believes in his name, they'll be able to speak in foreign tongues. They'll be able to handle deadly snakes, and they'll be able to drink poison, and it won't harm them. And so these are the verses that the Appalachian snake handlers use to justify their ritual practices.
And now the book of Mark is historically, that's the first book in the New Testament, is that right?
Yeah. Well, no, it's not the first book in the New. It's the first gospel of the New Testament. The writings of Paul actually were written before the writings of the Gospels.
So I would imagine then, I guess the idea is that the book of Mark then had a lot of bearing on the way the other Gospels were written.